to a keyboard, it starts to flow. But this week, I don't know if it was, maybe I was tired, maybe I just didn't make enough time, maybe my mind wasn't in the right spot, but, this is the best God gave me this week, I guess. But I struggled with the text. I went, John is always hard to read. He kind of rambles, and he's not as smooth as Luke. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God, and nothing was made that wasn't made through him. I mean, he kind of goes like that, and didn't find a lot there that spoke to me. So, I tried the Psalms and the generation to generation thing, but that didn't go anywhere. So I went back to the small pericope, the short passage that the lectionary gave us from Luke, the 2nd chapter, just several verses that talks about the early church. And I avoided that in a way because that's usually a Pentecost text. We usually go to the book of Acts after we're through the season of Easter. So I wasn't immediately drawn to that. And then I read it again and coincidentally went back and looked at the Psalm text and found exactly the same word in both passages, and it jumped out at me. It said that as those early people of faith lived, those around them looked at what they did, the amazing things they were doing, and had a feeling of awe. The word awe jumped out at me. And not necessarily in a great way, because, I don't have a sense of awe about a lot of things these days. I don't know about you. I mean, are there a lot of things that you look at and go, awe? Well, when you go to the doctor, of course, he or she says, say awe. But other than that, I look at stuff and, there was a time when a man on the moon, right? Or some of the other things, but all that stuff goes on. Once upon a time, gun violence, when people randomly attack schools or municipalities or movie theaters, that it used to cause me shock and awe, but it's almost every day anymore. In the last month, we even dropped the mother of all bombs. And there was a time when such an explosion would have been in the news for a long time. 4 to 8 hours, it was kind of old news, and we move on. And I asked myself, what has happened to me? Maybe what has happened to many people? Maybe what's happened to our culture that the shock and the awe sense of things that maybe they should have that feeling on us, right? But they really don't. I don't know if it's because we're numb. We're just used to them. We compartmentalize, well, that's there and I'm here, and so we just kind of moved on. If we are disengaged, or maybe we have just given up. I don't know. We've been at war. The United States has been engaged in the longest war in our history. And it, too, is like everyday stuff. It goes on, and for the most part, we go on here. And I looked at it, that war has cost the United States $3.6 trillion. Well, that should shock us, right? Which boils down to $8.6 million an hour. And I say that, and we take deep breaths, and then what do? We go on. I tried to avoid, all the discussion about health care this week, and it won't go away. It's going to be with us for a while, right? Because I really didn't know, having a chronic illness myself, I really didn't want to know what that might mean for me should things change in my situation, or I move to a different state, or however that ends up. But Friday evening, I couldn't help myself. We were in bed, Jean was asleep. I got out my iPhone and I looked what it might mean, and what it means is all the treatment I get now would no longer be available to me. And that didn't even shock me. Once again, I did not feel much except felt a little helpless and, to agree, hopeless. A psychologist once told me that that's a sign of depression. And I said, well, how do you get out of it? And he said to me, well, depression is kind of that sense of feeling everything's out of control, that it's out of your control, that there's really nothing you can do that matters. Well, how do you solve that? He says, well, you find at least one little thing that you can take control of. And then you do that, and then you build on that, and then you gradually kind of gather it all together until you get renewed strength and you find hope again. You get back in the game. And that makes a real difference. Now, when I thought about all of this, because that's my junk, that's my stuff, right? And I began to think about this passage in the book of Acts, it began to make sense to me. It began to correlate. Because we often assume that the early church, the early followers, were just all yay and hopeful and everything's going great and so forth. And they have this church that is just, but it wasn't that way. The early Christians were a ragtag group of people, very small in number. And when you look around the world that they were in, even though the Spirit of Christ was within them and the resurrection gave them personal hope, the world hadn't changed all that much. Rome was still in power and still very oppressive. Poverty was still the norm, with 95% living day to day and maybe 4 or 5% living in a different way. And what we know as a church was really nothing more than small groups of people trying to make a difference and do what they could. But the text says doing what they could, even in the smallest of ways, seemed like a miracle to everyone around them. And in other words, what they were doing was so different that other people stood in awe, even of the simple gifts of hope that they gave to them. The people who looked were in awe, and they said, who are these people? We want what they've got. We want some of that. We need some of that. And things began to change. It's not that, it's not that all of a sudden they created a perfect world. We know that's not true. It's not that all the difficult things and the complexity of their time went away. But gradually, subsequently, every generation building on what was passed on. And maybe that's why the generation to generation text was important. Because as one generation did what they could, the next generation got the baton to begin building on that and to do more. And over the centuries, there's so many things we take for granted that those people saw the issues of the day and did something. We had hospitals for those who struggled with mental illness. We had hospitals for those who were ill. We had schools, public education in this country, both higher education as well as just general elementary education grew out of our churches. Laws about child labor, civil rights, the abolition of slavery. Those were not overnight changes, but they were people who in difficult times said that they were called to make a difference, to change the world into a we rather than a me-centered society. The Roman emperor, there were many of them, but the Roman emperor of the 4th century, he followed Constantine. It was Constantine who converted to Christianity, and Christianity was no longer outlawed in the Roman Empire. And then somebody else followed him, and then Theodosius made it the official religion of Rome. But there were other emperors, and one of them was named Julian, and Julian was an individual who tried to turn everything back to the Roman gods and the Roman faith and attack Christians, so he earned the name Julian the Apostate. But there's a famous quote that Julian was extremely frustrated by these Christians. And the quote says, "Those cursed Galileans feed and care not only for their sick and hungry, but ours too." And the faith grew. No big thing just doing the simple things we should do. And when you listen to that quote, I hear within Julian the Apostate's comment, shock and awe. Awe that those people would do it to people who were not theirs, who were different, that they would care for them. It's really quite simple. Because the truth is, the arc of history is always bent, it's bent towards good, not because big, notable people do great and awesome things, but that everyday people do small, simple, yet what the world sees as so contrary that it too becomes awesome. The Roman Empire, as empires often do, lived by the theory of do unto others before they do it to you. Those early believers read it the right way, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. It's really simple. It's really simple because we are called not to build a great institution. We are called to make a difference in the world, to create a society where the least among us matter, where children and women are not objects, but equal and valued, where life, liberty, and the pursuit even of happiness should be guaranteed to all. And we take that for granted, that statement, but putting it in its historic context, saying that was extremely radical in and of itself. So much so that the rest of the world looked in awe at the society that we were trying to build. A light unto the nations, a city on a hill. What a dream. What a challenge. What a goal. Because we are called not to be citizens of any country, we are called to be citizens of God's kingdom. We are called to be citizens of God's kingdom. And if society has gone different directions, maybe we should quit blaming society and take some responsibility ourselves. Does the world look at us and what we do and who we are, and are they shocked by the witness we give? Do they stand in awe or not? You know, when we were having the parking lot issue with the youth parking out here, one of the comments that was on the neighborhood post internet board here in St. Pete Beach, an individual said, well, rather than fighting over whether the church should be able to have parking or not, just tear down the church, make it a parking lot, and then finally it'd be good for something. Oh, I got a little shock and awe out of you. But wouldn't it be nice if the shock and awe of what we do and what we stand for went the other way? It's something to think about, because each of us is called to be awesome, awe-inspiring. How do we take that to heart? And what will we do? Amen.
The Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. spoke and wrote about the beloved community